I have a cold, so I hope I don't start hacking in the middle of this thing. I'll try not to. But I do want to get some new stuff up here. What I'm trying to do, we're going to go over Baltimore today. So what I'm trying to do is give you stuff that is off the chart. In other words, it's constantly we're hearing stuff about the mafia in New York, Boston, Chicago, over and over. It gets old. So they were in other places, and so let's cover some of those. Now let's go to Anthony Messina. He had just arrived at the Belair Market, which was downtown Baltimore. It was the stomping grounds. This is June 17th, 1952. He filled his tank with gas. He drove up to Front Street, brought a newspaper from a street vendor, said he was going on a trip, and that was that. Then his wife said he never reported in, didn't know where he was. Then they found his body in the trunk of a car in the fish market area of Baltimore. Messini's car, he wasn't stuffed in his car, he was stuffed in somebody else's car, was found on a nearby street. And as I said, it had been greased, oiled, full of gas, ready to go. He was planning a long trip. I think he knew he was going to be killed, and he was just trying to get the hell out of town. Messini's own car was found on Enzer Street. Different way. Anyway, the car that Messini's corpse was found in, it was a 1943 sedan, was purchased at a dealer's at 4600 block of Edmondson Avenue the day before. The buyer gave his name as Tony Rosa. They said he spoke with a thick Italian accent. He was exceedingly pleasant, and he had a habit of smoothing his eyebrows with his fingers. That's all they got on this guy. This is what police think happened. Messina met up with his friend, Big Sam Zanino, also a mafia guy and a gambler, and a hired killer. This guy called himself Tony Rosa. They persuaded him somehow to get in the car they were driving, the car he was later found. They drove him to an unknown, isolated spot someplace. They forced him into the trunk, and then they shot him dead, and then they drove him, left his body in the market. So, they probably just went around the corner someplace and shot him. Anyway, Salvatore Big Sam Zanini, he was big in the sense that he was 5'2", he weighed 300 pounds, that kind of big, was also killed a day later. Zanini was a boxing promoter in Baltimore. It used to be a fight town. But he was also a full-time operator, gambler, and he operated in South Baltimore and once in a while out in the county, Anne Arundel County, which in those days was probably fairly rural, but growing. A good place to invest in. The state police found Zanino's blood-stained car in Claymont, Delaware, near Route 40. There was no body in it, but they found the car. And they figured Albert Anastasia didn't mind dropping dead bodies in Delaware. He'd done it in the past. To give you an example, in 1942, this hood named Tony Romero was found out there as well. Romero probably killed this guy named Peter Panto. Panto was an Italian immigrant. Despite what you might see in the movies, along the waterfront in New York in those days, in Jersey, almost all the people who worked there were Hispanic or Italian, and they were almost all illegal, and they were badly taken advantage of by the ILA, this really corrupt union that's still corrupt, and the mafia. I mean, just terrible what they did to these people. Panto was trying to get them organized. Oddly enough, the Catholic Church, was just terrified of Panto because he's a socialist. They were afraid, and that orders from Rome, that socialists would make their way into the Italian community in the U.S., and that would give them the start. So Panto had a whole lot of enemies, and they warned him, and he didn't pay attention. He was going to go visit his girlfriend, this girl named Mafia. Honestly, that was her name. And they snatched him off the street, shot him, buried him in a lime pit in New Jersey someplace. They know where the body is. There's a tree growing through it. They've taken x-rays. They just left it there. Anyway, so that was the end of Ramiro. He ends up in Guyana Court, Delaware. It's about 15 minutes from where they found Zanino's car. I should tell you, there's also a story that Tony Romo may have been murdered for stealing union dues from Anastasia, which, is a death warrant right there. So the cops went over Zanino's 52 Cadillac. It was registered in his name, but it was stolen. It was stolen from a doctor's office in Manhattan just a month before. And they picked up traces of what had been Nino Messina's blood, the guy that was killed back in Baltimore, and blood and bullet fragments. After killing Messina, Big Sam was murdered. What they figured is he didn't know. He thought Zanino thought they were just going to go pick Messina up, kill him, and that was that. He thought he was safe. Well, surprise, surprise. The word was that Big Sam and Nino Messina were killed on orders of New York, Albert Anastasia, because they were backing mob forces in Baltimore and Pennsylvania in a coup backed by mafia boss Vito Genovese to take Anastasia out. Genovese intended to take over what was then the Luciano crime family, but to do that, he'd have to take out Frank Costello, who was backed up by Albert Anastasia at the time. Genovese had been campaigning against Anastasia for months, calling him a lightning rod for the FBI, accusing him of selling memberships in his family, and out and out, he was just out of control. He said he was a murderer, a bloodthirsty murderer. I think he was actually selling memberships. Anyway, secretly backing Genovese up was Anastasia's own underboss, Carlo Gambino. Talk about the night of the long knives. These guys. So Anthony Messina, he was this old line Mangano loyalist. He and Mangano went way back. They were involved in a triple murder homicide shooting that took place back in 1925 on February 28 at John Center's restaurant at 514 Pearl Street in Syracuse. 3 hoods. Tony Zangari, who I know some other stuff about him, Vinny Borizzi and Charlie Sinsigali were sitting in the restaurant's main dining room when 2 excuse me again, I'm trying here, folks. Bear with me. 2 or 3 men walked into the back door, pulled out revolvers. Sengali, who was eating, got up and ran for the door, but they shot him through the head. He didn't make it. The other 2 guys, Zangari and Borizzi, didn't even get out of their chairs. They were killed right there. The motive behind the massacre was a dispute over bootleg territories. 2 of the killers were absolutely identified as Tony Polaro, a Brooklyn bootlegger, and Tony Messina, who was then living in Brooklyn as well. The 3rd shooter was believed to be Philip Mangano. After the murder, Mangano arranged for Messina to flee to Sicily, and he helped him return to the U.S. in about 1938-39. The New York had a warrant for his arrest for the murder in first degree, but the state, which is state police detectives to ensure Messina was in Italy in 1920, they weren't aware that he had returned to the U.S. and was living in Baltimore, what was then called the lay-low city for the American Mafia. Just go there, lay low, we'll make sure you get paid, mind your business. So in 1931, after the Castellamare War, Mangano went on to become boss of his own family, a power in the New York City Democratic politics as well. And he was a force in the New Jersey waterfront. His underboss was, everything goes back to it, Albert Anastasia. The relationship between Mangano and Anastasia was bad, to the point where Anastasia, backed up by Frank Costello, was more or less running his own family within Mangano's family. And that came to a head in April 1951. Anastasia made his move. Philip Mangano was found face down in the deep grass in the marshlands with 3 bullets in his head in the Bergen Beach section of Brooklyn on April 19, 1951. Like Messina, Mangano was probably conned by his friends to take a ride. They killed him and then they dumped him in the marshlands. Philip Mangano's brother, Vincent, disappeared forever a few days after his body was found. They don't know what happened to Vincent. Vincent was probably, he didn't have any connection to the 1925 triple murder in Syracuse, but he was a violent hood who could inflict serious damage on Anastasia. So the best thing to do, Anastasia figures, kill both of them and play it safe. By then, Anastasia's in trouble. Called before the Kefauver hearing on organized crime. He was a big witness. It was a big stink. And the federal government put the Immigration Naturalization Service on him. The INS acted to have him denaturalize citizenship. The IRS brought charges against him. I apologize again. I'm trying, people. Anastasia probably brought in a Sicilian hitman to murder Messina in the game, early on in the game. Who knows what Messina could have done against him, but Anastasia's fighting for his life, so getting rid of Messina was a smart move. As for Big Sam Zanino's murder, the killer, the man with the thick accent, calling himself Tony Rosa, was probably an imported killer from Sicily. He took Zanino off because he could link New York to the Messina murder. Maybe, who knows? So that's the story that happened there. I'll make sure I've got everything done. Yeah, that's it.